Guilty French Chateau. Night, late 1944. Rain streaks down the leaded glass of a requisitioned command post. Inside, the air is thick with cold stone and stale cigar smoke. A German field marshal leans over a vast map table. His face, etched by campaigns from Poland to Stalingrad, is a mask of weary disbelief. Before him are not battle plans. They are reconnaissance reports, shipping manifests, intercepted American supply logs. He traces a line with a gloved finger. The numbers defy all military logic. Thousands of tons of supplies. Per division, per day. Tanks, trucks, fuel, ammunition. Reports even mention shipments of ice cream machines and Coca-Cola. He picks up a damp photograph. A Normandy beachhead, not weeks, but mere days after the invasion. It is not a chaotic battlefield. It is a port, a city of steel and men risen from the sea. He had been trained for a war of maneuver, of tactics, of will. But this was something else entirely. This was a war of production. A war waged from factories 3,000 miles away. The German High Command simply could not comprehend how it was possible. To understand that German general's astonishment, one must look not to the battlefields of 1944, but to the American factories of 1942. While the Wehrmacht was fueled by the conquest of its neighbors, its war machine was a fragile, intricate thing. It ran on captured oil, forced labor, and an industrial base strained to its absolute limit. It was an economy of scarcity, fighting a war of annihilation. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of war was being waged. It began not with a gunshot, but with the stroke of a pen and the flip of a switch. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States executed the most rapid and colossal industrial mobilization in human history. The nation's peacetime economy, the largest on Earth, was not merely adapted for war. It was utterly transformed. Int Detroit Auto Plant. Day 1942. Civilian car assembly lines are being ripped out. Massive presses once stamping out fenders are now retooled to stamp the armored hulls of tanks. XT California Shipyard. Day. Duty where thousands of workers, men and women, swarm over the skeleton of a Liberty ship. Welding arcs flash like constellations. A completed ship slides into the water as the keel for the next is laid just moments later. Int Aircraft Factory. Day. 31 A B-24 Liberator bomber. A mile of wiring and thousands of parts moves down an assembly line that stretches for a full mile. At its peak, one is completed every 63 minutes. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had called for America to become the great arsenal of democracy. It was not a political slogan. It was a production order. By 1944, American factories were producing more war material than all Axis nations combined. 2/3 of all Allied military equipment came from the United States. This industrial tsunami had to be directed somewhere. By late 1943, at the Tehran Conference, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, made the final decision. To relieve the immense pressure on the Soviet Union and break the stalemate, a massive cross-channel invasion of northern France would take place in the spring of 1944. Its codename, Operation Overlord. The target was Fortress Europe, a continent garrisoned by millions of German soldiers, defended by the formidable Atlantic Wall, a coastal defense system of concrete, steel, and firepower, stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. Breaching it would be the most complex military operation ever attempted, but the invasion itself was only the first problem. The second and arguably greater challenge was sustaining the force once it was ashore. An army does not live off the land in modern warfare. It is tethered to a lifeline of supply that stretches back to its home factories. For the Americans, that lifeline was 3,000 miles of hostile ocean. First, the U-boat menace had to be broken. The Battle of the Atlantic, a brutal, years-long campaign of attrition, was the silent, essential prerequisite for Overlord. By mid-1943, With improved technology and tactics, the Allies gained the upper hand, turning the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a highway. Then began the buildup. The British Isles, a nation that had stood alone for so long, became a forward operating base of unimaginable scale. It was dubbed Stationary Aircraft Carrier No. 1. Southern England, in particular, transformed into the largest military camp the world had ever seen. Ancient pastures disappeared under seas of stacked ammunition crates. Quaint country lanes groaned under the weight of Sherman tanks. Forests of tents housed over 1.5 million American soldiers, a friendly, noisy, and overwhelming occupation force. Every port, from Bristol to Southampton, was choked with shipping. The numbers were staggering. By the spring of 1944, over 2 million tons of supplies had already been landed. 17 million tons of material would follow. This included 20,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 40,000 jeeps, and nearly 200,000 other transport vehicles. The logisticians of the U.S. Army's Services of Supply, under the command of Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, planned not just for the invasion, but for the entire campaign to follow. They calculated fuel consumption for the drive to Paris, replacement parts for the push to the Rhine, and ammunition expenditures for the final assault on Germany itself. All this material, an entire nation's industrial might, was now coiled like a spring in southern England, aimed at a 50-mile stretch of hostile French coastline. A coiled spring, however powerful, is useless until it is released. The German High Command, and specifically Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, knew this. Rommel's entire defensive strategy for the Atlantic Wall was built on a single, seemingly ironclad assumption: to sustain a modern mechanized army, the Allies would have to capture a major deepwater port within the first few days of landing: Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais. His plan was brutally simple. He would allow the Allies to land on the open beaches. He would contain them there on the sand, denying them a port. Cut off from reinforcement and heavy supply, the beachhead would become a killing ground. The invasion force, starved of fuel and ammunition, would be annihilated by his panzer divisions held in reserve. The lessons of history supported his logic. No amphibious invasion of this scale had ever succeeded without the swift capture of a port facility. But the Allied planners were not refighting old wars. They were haunted by the memory of the 1942 Dieppe raid, a catastrophic failure that proved the immense cost of a frontal assault on a defended port. Their solution was not to fight for a port. It was to build one. XT, secret UK construction sites. Day. For leaf bodies across the United Kingdom, in secluded estuaries and quiet harbors. A secret project of unprecedented scale was underway. Thousands of civilian workers toiled in shifts 24 hours a day. They were building hollow concrete monoliths, some as long as a city block and taller than a 6-story building. They were fabricating hundreds of sections of floating steel roadway and massive pierheads with retractable legs. This was Operation Mulberry. The plan was to construct 2 entire artificial harbors, the size of the port of Dover, and tow them in pieces across the English Channel in the wake of the invasion fleet. The components were gargantuan. The concrete caissons, codenamed Phoenixes, would be flooded and sunk in a precise line offshore, creating a calm water breakwater. The floating roadways, codenamed Whales, would snake for miles from the shore out to the spud pierheads. These pierheads, anchored to the seabed by their giant legs, could rise and fall with the 20-foot Normandy tides, allowing ships to unload their cargo around the clock, regardless of conditions. It was an idea of such audacity, it bordered on fantasy. Fuel was an equally critical problem. An armored division consumed hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline per day. Relying on vulnerable tankers shuttling back and forth across the channel was a recipe for disaster. The answer was another secret project, codenamed Pluto, for pipeline under the ocean. Engineers developed a 3-inch diameter, flexible armored pipeline. It was wound onto enormous floating bobbins 60 feet high, called conundrums. These would be towed across the channel, unreeling the pipeline onto the seafloor. Once connected, they would pump a ceaseless, invisible river of fuel directly from pumping stations in England to hidden depots in France, bypassing the beaches and the ports entirely. The innovation extended to the very tip of the spear. To breach Rommel's beach defenses, the mines, the barbed wire, the concrete bunkers, a menagerie of specialized armored vehicles was developed. Known as Hobart's Funnies, they were the brainchild of British Major General Percy Hobart. There were Sherman tanks modified with giant rotating flails to detonate mines. There were Churchill tanks that could lay their own bridges over ditches or fire a massive demolition charge to obliterate a bunker. There were even amphibious duplex drive or DD tanks, designed to swim ashore from landing craft miles out at sea, providing immediate fire support for the infantry. These grand, audacious engineering projects were the skeleton of the invasion. But the lifeblood was found in the meticulous planning of every single item an army would need, from bullets and blood plasma to the very morale of the common soldier. The grand engineering was the skeleton. The meticulous planning was the brain. But the heart of this logistical machine was human. It was a war fought not only by generals on maps, but by anonymous men with clipboards, wrenches, and loading hooks. The U.S. Army's Services of Supply was an empire unto itself, a uniformed corporation with millions of employees. Its product was victory. Its currency was tonnage. In England, this organization managed a domain of depots, workshops, and hospitals that dwarfed the cities they surrounded. They operated hundreds of miles of their own railways and thousands of their own trucks before a single boot touched French soil. This work was seldom glorious. It was grueling, repetitive, and dangerous. It was done by stevedores from Baltimore and longshoremen from San Francisco, organized into port battalions that worked around the clock under the perpetual threat of Luftwaffe raids. It was done by engineers who laid roads and pipelines in the clinging English mud. And it was done, in large part, by segregated African-American quartermaster and transportation units. These soldiers were often denied combat roles, yet they performed the Herculean tasks upon which the entire invasion depended. They loaded the ships, drove the trucks, and stacked the ammunition that would empower the front lines. They were the muscle of the miracle, the unseen architects of the coming offensive. Every bullet, every can of rations, every pint of blood plasma passed through their hands, a testament to a system that valued organization as much as it valued firepower. This human system created a new type of strategic reality. The German military tradition was rooted in the concept of the decisive battle, the Kesselschlacht, or cauldron battle, where superior tactics and fighting spirit could annihilate an opposing force. German engineering reflected this. They built magnificent complex weapons like the Tiger and Panther tanks, machines that were often superior in a one-on-one fight. But they were difficult to manufacture, consumed vast resources, and were nearly impossible to repair in the field. A Tiger tank knocked out on the battlefield was often a permanent loss, a blow to the war effort from which recovery was slow. The German army was a finely crafted sword, brittle and irreplaceable. The American army, by contrast, was a tidal wave. Its doctrine was built on mass, momentum, and replacement. The M4 Sherman tank was not the best tank in the world, but it was reliable, easily repaired with standardized parts, and crucially, it could be produced in staggering numbers. For every Sherman lost in combat, 5 more were coming off assembly lines. Allied commanders understood this brutal arithmetic. They could afford to trade losses for ground. They could sustain an offensive for weeks, then months, knowing that a constant, unbroken stream of men and material was flowing across the Atlantic. For the German soldier in a hedgerow, or the panzer commander peering through his periscope, this was the most demoralizing fact of the war. They were not just fighting men. They were fighting factories. They were fighting an enemy who could replace his entire army, and then do it again. This abstract power, this war of numbers and production, was about to become brutally, physically real on the sands of Normandy. This war of production was also a war of design philosophy, visible even in the most mundane objects. Consider the humble fuel can. The German Wehrmacht Einheitskanister was a masterpiece of battlefield engineering. Its 3 handles allowed one man to carry 2 full cans, or 2 men to carry 1. An air pocket ensured it floated if dropped in water, and a clever spout design allowed for smooth, fast pouring. The British, encountering it in North Africa, immediately recognized its superiority over their own flimsy tins. They copied it, naming it the jerry can. The Americans in turn mass-produced millions. This small act of reverse engineering was a symptom of a larger strategic truth. The Allied war effort was a pragmatic system, willing to adopt any advantage, no matter how small. This pragmatism was scaled up to the entire arsenal. The American 2.5-ton GMC truck, the famed Deuce and a Half, was the logistical workhorse of the war. Over 800,000 were built. They shared engines, transmissions, and axles with other vehicles, creating a vast ecosystem of interchangeable parts. A mechanic in Normandy could repair a truck using parts scavenged from a dozen others. The German army, in contrast, was a museum of captured equipment. Their divisions fielded a bewildering array of Czech, French, and Russian trucks, each requiring unique spare parts that were often impossible to find. Their own magnificent tanks were so complex that a broken transmission could sideline a Panther for weeks. The American system was built for resilience and relentless momentum. The German system for peak performance and inevitable breakdown. This momentum would be tested not in the weeks after the landing, but in the months that followed. After the Allied breakout from the Normandy hedgerows in August 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army raced across France at a speed that stunned the world and its own logisticians. The advance was so rapid it completely outran its supply lines. The railways were obliterated by Allied bombing. The newly captured port of Cherbourg was a wreck. The entire offensive was in danger of grinding to a halt for lack of fuel. The solution was an operation of pure, brute force logistics, the Red Ball Express. For 83 days, a network of one-way highways was closed to all other traffic. On these roads, a continuous convoy of trucks, nearly 6,000 of them, ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The drivers, over 75% of whom were African-American soldiers from segregated transport units, pushed their vehicles and themselves to the absolute limit. They drove through the night, often under fire, with headlights blazing in defiance of blackout orders. Mechanics performed repairs on the roadside as the endless columns rumbled past. At its peak, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies to the front lines every single day. It was a lifeline of gasoline and steel, a logistical blitzkrieg that enabled the armored spearheads to keep moving. To the German commanders, who had so often seen their own advances wither for lack of fuel, this unstoppable river of supply was not just a logistical feat. It was a psychological weapon. But the American logistical mind calculated more than just fuel and ammunition. It calculated the value of a single soldier. The system was designed not only to equip him for battle, but to save him when he fell. This began with morale. Coca-Cola bottling plants were established in captured cities. Donut-making machines and mobile bakeries operated just behind the lines. Ice cream was manufactured on specially designed barges. These were not luxuries. They were calculated investments in combat effectiveness. A soldier who felt a connection to home, however small, would fight harder and endure longer. This philosophy reached its apex in the medical evacuation chain. From the moment a soldier was hit, a system clicked into motion. A medic administered life-saving sulfa powder and morphine. He was moved to a battalion aid station, then a field hospital where surgeons worked in tents just miles from the fighting. Most critically, the mass production and distribution of dried blood plasma meant that shock, the great killer of the wounded, could be treated on the spot. If his wounds were severe, He could be on an airplane and in a fully equipped hospital in England within hours. This unprecedented system gave the American soldier the highest combat survival rate of any army in the war. It was the ultimate expression of a military that understood its greatest asset was not its tanks or its planes, but its people. All of these systems, from the design of a fuel can to the delivery of blood plasma, were built for a single purpose. They were the unseen gears of a machine designed to function under the most extreme pressure imaginable, the chaos. In the pre-dawn blackness of June 6, 1944, the machine was set in motion. An armada of nearly 7,000 vessels, the largest in human history, churned through the choppy waters of the English Channel. It carried 156,000 men towards the coast of Normandy. Every vessel had a designated place, every unit a specific objective. Every minute of the coming battle was scheduled, down to the second. The plan, years in the making, was a masterpiece of logistical choreography. At 06:30, as the sky began to lighten, the ramps dropped. Ext, Omaha Beach, dawn. June 6, 1944. The plan disintegrated on contact with reality. At Omaha Beach, the sector assigned to the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, the intricate schedule shattered. The preliminary naval and aerial bombardment had been tragically ineffective, leaving the German defenses atop the bluffs almost entirely intact. Machine gun fire from fortified positions like Whiterstan's Nest 62 raked the incoming landing craft. The specialized armor, the funnies designed to clear the way, met with disaster. Of the 32 amphibious DD tanks launched from 5 kilometers out, 27 sank in the rough seas, taking their crews with them. The infantry, laden with 60 pounds of gear, were deposited not on a secured beach but into a perfectly designed kill zone. They were pinned down at the water's edge, behind the very obstacles the engineers were supposed to have already cleared. The tide was coming in, shrinking the beach and threatening to drown the wounded. The logistical flow, the lifeblood of the invasion, stopped before it could begin. Landing craft carrying artillery, trucks, and bulldozers circled offshore, unable to land. The beachmasters, the uniformed traffic cops of the invasion, could only watch as their carefully timed waves of landings piled up into a chaotic, burning traffic jam. The beach was not a port, it was a morgue. The flow of supplies was reversed. The only things coming off the beach were the dead and wounded. By 08:30, the situation was critical. The German 352nd Infantry Division, veterans of the Eastern Front, poured relentless fire onto the men huddled behind a thin strip of shale. The American command structure had broken down. Junior officers and NCOs took charge, urging small, desperate groups forward. But they needed support. They needed firepower. They needed the tools the logisticians had promised. The decision was made to abandon the plan. It was a choice born of desperation. Naval commanders ordered their landing craft infantry and landing craft tank to ignore the schedule, to ignore the obstacles, and to force their way ashore. They drove their flat-bottomed vessels directly onto the beach, ramming through wreckage, grounding themselves under withering fire. They became stationary pillboxes, sacrificing the ship to deliver its cargo of men and a few precious vehicles. It was a brutal, costly improvisation. Still, it was not enough. The German defenses held. The beachhead was a sliver of sand, less than 50 yards deep in places. The entire invasion, the fate of Operation Overlord, teetered on the brink of catastrophic failure. Then another improvisation. Rear Admiral Carlton F. Bryant, commanding the Naval Gunfire Support Group, received frantic calls for help. He ordered his destroyers to do the unthinkable, sail directly towards the shore, into waters that were unswept for mines and perilously shallow. Ships like the USS Carmack and USS McCook closed to within 800 yards of the beach, their hulls nearly scraping the sand. Their 5-inch guns, designed for naval combat, became the most precise and powerful artillery the infantry had. From the beach, forward observers radioed coordinates. The destroyer's guns answered, firing point-blank into the German bunkers and trench lines on the bluffs. The effect was devastating. Concrete emplacements were systematically smashed. Machine gun nests were silenced. The naval gunfire was the key, the tool that finally unlocked the door. It was a logistical delivery of high explosives, ordered not by a planner in London, but by a desperate lieutenant on a blood-soaked beach. By midday, small groups of American soldiers were finally fighting their way off the beach and up the bluffs. The crisis was passing, but the cost was immense. Omaha was secured, but it was a wreck. The beach was a graveyard of twisted steel, burning vehicles and drowned equipment. The meticulous logistical timetable was in ruins. Thousands of tons of supplies and vehicles were still waiting on ships offshore, with no organized way to bring them in. The foothold in Fortress Europe was tenuous, fragile, and now, as the sun set on the longest day, the German commanders began to understand what was happening. Their panzer divisions, the hammer they had held in reserve to smash the invasion, were beginning to move. The battle for the beach was over. The race to supply the battle for Normandy was about to begin. The dawn of June 7th revealed the scale of the challenge. Omaha Beach was not a beachhead. It was a scrapyard, a 10-mile strip of sand littered with the high-water mark of a technological tide. Drowned tanks, burning trucks, shattered landing craft, and the grim detritus of battle. The meticulously planned logistical machine was choked at its throat. The German panzer divisions, though delayed by command confusion and Allied air attacks, were still a mortal threat. The plan was dead. The race was on. A new kind of combat began, fought not with rifles, but with bulldozers and welding torches. U.S. Army engineers and Navy Seabees waded into the surf. Their battlefield, the chaotic shoreline itself. They became salvage crews under fire. With armored bulldozers, they shoved wrecked vehicles into makeshift causeways. They blasted channels through the German beach obstacles. They laid down steel matting over the soft sand, creating the first primitive roads. They were imposing order on chaos, 1 ton of steel at a time. The true heroes of this race were 2 unglamorous utilitarian designs. The first was the landing ship tank, the LST, a vessel derided by its crews as a large, slow target. But it possessed a unique, war-winning feature. It could run itself directly onto the beach, open its massive bow doors, drop a ramp, and disgorge its cargo of tanks, trucks, and artillery directly onto the sand. As the engineers cleared paths, the LSTs began to ground themselves in a steady, unending rhythm, becoming the crucial bridge between the fleet and the shore. The second was the DUKW, an amphibious 2.5-ton truck. These ducks were the logistical insects of the invasion, swarming from the cargo ships anchored miles offshore. They would drive off the ramp of a larger vessel, swim through the waves, and drive straight up the beach to inland supply dumps, bypassing the wreckage entirely. They created a continuous, vital ferry service for ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. While this brutal, improvised system took hold, the grander plan was unfolding. On June 9th, the first components of the American Mulberry Harbor, codenamed Mulberry A, began to arrive off Omaha Beach. It was a site of breathtaking ambition. Giant concrete Phoenix caissons were towed into position and sunk, their upper structures forming a solid breakwater against the channel waves. The long, flexible whale roadway snaked out from the shore to meet the floating spud pierheads. For 10 days, a man-made port, a city of concrete and steel, rose from the sea. By June 18th, it was operational. The logistical miracle seemed complete. Then, on June 19th, the weather turned. A storm, the worst to strike the English Channel in over 40 years, descended on the Normandy coast. For 3 days, hurricane-force winds and mountainous waves pounded the beachhead. The Allied fleet was scattered. Landing operations ceased completely. And the brand-new Mulberry Harbor, the Allies' greatest engineering triumph, was systematically torn to pieces. The concrete caissons were smashed. The floating roadways were twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The great secret weapon, the key to sustaining the invasion, was utterly destroyed. To the German defenders, it was a divine intervention. The Allied invasion force was now cut off, its artificial port a ruin. It was the exact scenario Rommel had predicted. This, they believed, was the moment to strike, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their enemy. The mulberry was not the miracle. The miracle was the system's ability to function without it. The true miracle was happening on the sand. While the storm raged, the logisticians redrew their plans. When the skies cleared, they did not despair. They doubled down. The wreckage of Mulberry A was cannibalized for parts to reinforce the surviving British harbor at Arromanches, and at Omaha. The brute force method of beaching LSTs and running DUKWs was refined and scaled up to an industrial level. The numbers that resulted were what broke the German will. In the days following the storm, with their artificial harbor gone, the Americans landed an average of 15,000 tons of supplies and 15,000 men per day directly onto the open beach. Rhino ferries, makeshift barges made from pontoons and powered by outboard motors, began offloading cargo from ships that couldn't beach themselves. The flow of material was not just restored, it was increased. The beachhead was no longer a fragile foothold. It was a functioning port, more efficient than many established harbors in peacetime. The German generals watching from their bunkers could not comprehend it. They had witnessed the storm. They had seen the harbor destroyed. By all the laws of military science, the invasion should have withered and died. Instead, it grew stronger. The logistical race had been won. The beachhead was secure, not as a temporary lodgment, but as a massive, unshakable launch pad for the conquest of Europe. This launch pad, forged on the open sand, became the engine of the Allied advance. By the end of June 1944, just 3 weeks after the landings, the chaos of D-Day had been replaced by a cold, industrial efficiency. The Normandy beaches were now the busiest ports on the planet. Over 1 million men, 566,000 tons of supplies, and 171,000 vehicles had been put ashore. The trickle of men and material that had fought its way up the bluffs of Omaha was now a torrent, flooding into the heart of the Norman countryside. For the German soldier trapped in the dense hedgerows, the bocage, the war became an experience of constant, overwhelming pressure. He was fighting an enemy who seemed to have infinite resources. His own supply lines were a nightmare. Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, owned the daytime sky. A single German truck moving on a road was a death sentence. A panzer division might wait days for a few hundred gallons of fuel, while American artillery batteries fired thousands of shells in a single afternoon barrage. The German command structure, which had prided itself on tactical flexibility, was paralyzed. They could see the buildup. Their reconnaissance could count the ships, but they were powerless to stop it. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, later described the German perspective with stark clarity. The enemy's material superiority was something which our soldiers had never imagined. The fact that the enemy could land such quantities of weapons, equipment, and troops in spite of the bad weather, and then could go on developing his beachhead, was a surprise which had a paralyzing effect on the German command. This paralysis was shattered on July 25th. The accumulated material weight was unleashed in Operation Cobra. After a colossal carpet bombing by thousands of Allied heavy bombers tore a hole in the German lines near St. Lo, American armored divisions poured through the gap. The static grinding warfare of the hedgerows was over. The war of movement had begun. What followed was a rout. The German 7th Army, once the proud defender of Fortress Europe, was outflanked, encircled, and systematically destroyed in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. By the end of August, the battle for Normandy was over. It was an Allied victory of staggering proportions, and a German defeat from which the Wehrmacht in the West would never fully recover. But the price of this victory was etched into the landscape and the lives of a generation. The Norman countryside was a wasteland of shell craters, burned-out tanks, and hastily dug graves. The campaign had cost the Allies over 226,000 casualties. German losses were even more catastrophic, with an estimated 200,000 killed or wounded, and another 200,000 taken prisoner. The ancient cities of Caen and Saint-Lô were little more than rubble, and tens of thousands of French civilians had perished in the crossfire. The logistical miracle had delivered the tools of victory, but it had also delivered the means for unprecedented destruction. The German army was broken, its remnants streaming back towards the borders of the Reich. The road to Paris and beyond lay open. Yet for the Allied logisticians, the greatest success of the campaign had created their next, and perhaps greatest, challenge. The challenge was one of success. The Allied armies, unleashed from Normandy, were now advancing across France faster than any planner had dared to hope. General Patton's Third Army was a blur on the map, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. But this triumphant spearhead was tethered to the beaches by a logistical umbilical cord that was stretching to the breaking point. Every mile gained was another mile a gallon of fuel, a box of ammunition, or a food ration had to travel. The French railway system, a primary target of the Allied air forces for months, was a tangled ruin. The port of Cherbourg, captured in late June, had been so thoroughly demolished by its German defenders that it would take months to become fully operational. The offensive was in danger of starving itself to death. The Allied response was not one of finesse, but of overwhelming, organized force. The Red Ball Express, a continuous 24-hour truck convoy system, became the artery of the advance. It was a monumental undertaking, a testament to the power of brute force organization. But it was a temporary, desperate measure. The strain on men and machines was immense. By September, the advance began to slow, then halt. The Allied armies had for a time outrun their own miracle. This pause gave the shattered German forces a precious, unexpected gift, time to retreat, regroup, and man the formidable defenses of the Siegfried Line along the border of the Reich itself. The psychological impact of the summer campaign, however, was permanent. For the German High Command, the lessons of Normandy were brutal and absolute. Their strategy, built on the assumption that they could isolate and destroy the invasion on the beaches, had been proven utterly wrong. They had not been outfought, they had been overwhelmed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reported to Berlin with grim finality. It is a war of attrition. There is no way of forcing a decision. We have to face the fact that the enemy's superiority, especially in the air, is so great that our operations are as good as paralyzed. This was the voice of a military tradition that had conquered a continent, now admitting defeat not to a general, but to a system. This new reality reshaped the very nature of Allied strategic command. The question was no longer if they could supply the front, but who would receive the lion's share. A bitter debate erupted between the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who argued for a single, concentrated armored thrust into Germany, the single dagger, and the American Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower, ever the logistician, opted for a broad front strategy, advancing all his armies toward the Rhine simultaneously. It was a slower, more methodical approach, but it was one his logistical system could sustain. It was a strategy dictated not by tactical brilliance, but by the relentless mathematics of supply and demand. By the autumn of 1944, an air of overconfidence had settled over the Allied camp. The rapid liberation of France and Belgium fueled a belief that the war would be over by Christmas. But the German army, fighting on its own soil, was far from broken. The logistical challenges of a winter campaign, combined with this Allied optimism, would set the stage for the bloody battles in the Hürtgen forest and the shocking German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Yet the ultimate outcome was no longer in doubt. The Normandy campaign had proven a new and terrible doctrine of modern warfare. It was a doctrine where victory was forged not in the heat of a single decisive battle, but in the cold calculus of production schedules, shipping manifests, and supply depots. It demonstrated that a nation's industrial capacity, its ability to organize, transport, and replace, was the ultimate strategic weapon. For the German soldier, the war was now a hopeless struggle against an enemy who could not be bled, could not be stopped, and whose true weapon was not the tank or the bomber, but the simple, brutal power of arithmetic. The power of arithmetic. In the end, this was the fundamental, world-altering truth revealed on the shores of Normandy. It was a new doctrine of war, one where the slide rule was as mighty as the sword. The decisive battle was not fought in a single day or a single place. It was won over years, in thousands of factories and shipyards, by millions of anonymous workers who never heard a shot fired in anger. The front line no longer ended at the horizon. It stretched 3,000 miles across an ocean, back to the ore mines of Minnesota and the oil fields of Texas. This system, this logistical colossus, did not vanish when the guns fell silent. It became the blueprint for the post-war world. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt a shattered Europe, was not an act of charity alone. It was a logistical operation of unprecedented scale, applying the lessons of the Red Ball Express to the task of peace. The military-industrial complex that defined the Cold War was the permanent embodiment of this wartime mobilization. The global supply chains that power the modern economy, the container ships, the vast ports, the intricate networks, are the direct descendants of the LSTs and Mulberry Harbors. The German generals in their French chateaux were not simply defeated. They were made obsolete. They were the last practitioners of a form of warfare that died in the Normandy surf, a war of maneuver and elan crushed by the relentless, impersonal weight of production. They were confronted by an enemy who had weaponized the assembly line, who had turned the principles of industrial management into a strategy for global conquest. Today, the remnants of this effort are quiet monuments. A concrete caisson of the Mulberry Harbor still rests in the shallows off Arromanches, a silent testament to audacious engineering. The hedgerows of the Bocage have grown back. The beaches are once again places of peace. But the miracle that occurred here was not one of divine intervention or of singular genius. It was a human miracle of organization, of shared purpose, and of scale. It was the moment modern America, a nation built on industry, fully realized the power it could project, changing the map of the world and the very nature of power itself, forever.